But anyway, welcome with Coffee with your consultant. My name is Victor Valle Jr. I'm a risk management consulting serving the Southwest region. And along with my co-workers, with Ernesto Galindo serving the Northwest region also, and Lisa McKay, risk management consultant, serving the Southeast region. Is that right?
Yes,
Got it.
sir.
So far, so good.
Morning.
And Todd Kiesel, risk management consulting, serving the Northeast region.
Thank you, Victor. Good morning, everybody.
Yes, welcome. Today we wanted to get together to talk about some frequently asked questions about our risk management pool coverages that are asked by our members as we go visit counties. So you might have the same questions or additional questions. Please ask us during our discussions. We'll be going over questions per line of coverage. We ask you to, if you have comments, also we welcome them, and we ask you to participate. Again, relax. We just want to talk to you. Take a drink of your coffee or your favorite beverage. And thank you again for joining us. Like I said, we welcome you, and we welcome your questions and comments. Me and Todd will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions, put them in your chat box. And that's found, if you go down at your screen, at the bottom right hand, there should be a little bubble with a question. Click that, and that should open the chat box. And we'll be monitoring for those questions and answer them per coverage questions.
Victor, if they want to practice, they can go into the chat box and say good morning and where you're from right now. And as you can see, we had some technical difficulties, so Victor shut his laptop down. So I'll be monitoring the chat box, and I'll keep up with y'all. Thank you from Chambers County and from Gray County. Welcome. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Yes, this will make it better if y'all participate. So thank you for joining us again. And this is a risk management consultant team presentation. Each of us here go to visit counties, and each of us help with the risk management pool coverages. But even though each county is unique, all of they ask us some of the same questions, risk management pool questions. So some of the same questions because you have some of the same common exposures or risks at your county.
Absolutely.
So also, I want to mention something that we've trained on before it's the risk management process. We've trained this at County Management Risk Conference at the past. We've trained on webinars, and we've even trained on-site regional trainings on the risk management process. And the first step of the risk management process is to identify your exposures. And that's one of the main things we're going to be doing here today, is identifying some unique exposures of county government. Also, we're going to be using step 2, which is a little analysis of the exposure. And then step 3 of the risk management process is risk control. We won't talk a lot about risk control, but I know we do help in that area also. The fourth step of the risk management process is finance. And this is where the risk management pool coverages come in, because actually the coverages help finance your losses. And the final step of the risk management process is administration. So we administer all our plans and our risk control techniques, and that's part of the administration. But for now, let's go back to the frequently asked questions. And before I go all TAC conferences, I do have to read our disclaimer. And it is, the information presented in this session is for educational purposes only. Coverage scenarios, recommendations, or best practices presented are not requirements of coverage. Any claim scenario discussed is hypothetical and is not an official coverage determination. Coverage as provided by the TAC Risk Management Pool is subject to the terms and conditions of the applicable coverage documents. So that's our disclaimer. This is a conversation in general and not specific to any claim. So the first coverage we're going to be talking about is going to be the workers' comp coverage. And usually we use the acronym of workers, WC. For workers' comp. So that's one acronym that we commonly use when we're talking to each other. We say, hey, how's the WC doing? Mm-hmm. And we automatically know it's workers' comp coverage. So let's start with my first question, and it will be on workers' compensation. And Todd, let me ask you, under the workers' comp coverage, are extension agents covered under the TAC Risk Management Pool workers' compensation coverage?
Thank you, Victor. And that's a question that a lot of us are asked. And I can understand where the confusion comes into play, because The counties, you all provide a supplement to the county extension agents. But really, workers' compensation comes down to who is covered and who is employed. And county extension agents, technically speaking, are not employed by the county, so the workers' compensation coverage would not be applicable to them. So, and that question gets asked quite a bit, and as we all know, most of our members, workers' comp, are renewing January 1, so this is kind of workers' comp renewal season. It's a good time to think about these kinds of exposures, but just know that we do not cover the extension agents because they're not employed by the county. And as always, if questions like that come up, reach out to any one of us, and we'll help you with those questions and answers. Back to you, Victor.
Lisa, let me ask you another one under the workers' comp coverage. Who is considered a volunteer under the workers' comp coverage?
Okay, so under the workers' compensation coverage, the county has the option to add the optional coverage, and that would include your volunteer firefighters, law enforcement, your reserve deputies, emergency medical personnel, jurors, or election workers that are non-employees. This coverage must be approved by Commissioner's Court if the county elects this. This is the perfect time. Our work comp renewal questionnaires just went out. And as Todd said, the coverage renews on January 1st. So if you want to look at any of these optional coverages, please let one of us know, one of your risk management consultants or your member service rep, and we can provide you the information if this is a coverage you want to take to court for them to consider adding. We can also tell you and look at what you currently have and tell you what of these optional coverages the court has elected in the past.
Our presentation came very timely because they just received that
Absolutely.
packet. So there should be a form
Perfect
there
timing.
where it talks about volunteers. And don't forget your volunteers in general. I think there's a code for that.
Yes,
just
volunteers, all
period,
others.
out
Yes,
there.
there is.
So,
Thank you,
So
Victor.
we've talked about extension agents under the workers' comp. We've talked about volunteers under the workers' comp. But Ernesto, let me ask you, who is considered an elected official and how do you make sure they're included under the workers' comp coverage?
Well, that's an excellent question, Victor. And as in the case of the volunteers that Lisa just mentioned, an elected official is anybody who's been appointed to office to an election. They are not employees of the county. Therefore, they're not covered by the workers' compensation automatically. They need to be added to the coverage to an endorsement, like Lisa indicated, the endorsement for volunteers and so on and so forth. So we need to make sure that they're added to your coverage document. We also get the questions as far as appointed officials, as in the case of the county auditors. County auditors, they're automatically covered like any other regular employee of the county. And as Lisa indicated, now is the time to review those endorsements, make sure that all your employees that are not automatically covered by your workers' compensation are provided with some sort of coverage. We had a situation a few years ago where an elected official came to the Austin area to visit with a state representative. Unfortunately, that person sustained an injury in transit to the office of the state rep. In that particular case, that employee, that elected official, was not covered under the workers' compensation coverage. Therefore, that claim was not covered. So we highly encourage you to take time to review your endorsements.
I know for my region, I think most of my members make sure that those elected officials are covered.
Yes.
Yeah, likewise, and to Ernesto's example there, if they're not covered, they're gonna get their injury fixed by their health insurance. And health insurance, you've got deductibles, you have caps and those kinds of things. And the workers' compensation coverage can help them meet their needs of, they're not technically employed, but the optional coverage can provide coverage for elected officials.
Correct, yes. And that also needs to go through Commissioner's Court to get approved and added on out there. So we've talked about 3 unique exposures or personnel for county government that we don't see in private industry and other items. But there's one more type of person that comes up to the county government. And Todd, I want to ask you this question regarding contractors. Are contractors covered under the TAC Risk Management Pool workers' comp coverage when they're doing work on the county premises or county operations?
So they are not. So that's a great question, and it's coming up more and more because everybody's going through such growth. So remember, when you have a contractor coming to the county, whether it be an HVAC contractor, a painting contractor, they might be building a building or anything like that, they are not covered by the county's workers' compensation coverage, nor can we add them. So one thing you're going to want to make sure is that when your contractors come on board, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more depth down the road here in our session this morning, but when your contractors are coming in, you want to make sure that they have their own workers' compensation coverage and getting a certificate of insurance from them.
Yes.
So, great question.
That's a good point.
And I was thinking if they have any subs, you want to get their make sure they have coverage also, workers' comp.
Great point. Anything that's applicable to a contractor, you want to make it applicable to those subcontractors that they work with.
Yeah.
And I think we're
protect the
wrapping
county.
up workers' comp, but I wanted
Yeah.
to just send out a reminder. If you have any questions, put them into the chat box, and I'll keep up with it, and we'll address them as they come. So thank you, everybody. So
Does
far.
anybody out there have any big projects going on right now? Have you checked to see if those contractors have proper coverage? That would be a good time to do it as a reminder. Now that we're talking about contract services, that reminds me about another type of contract. And we're going to change gears a little bit here. We're going to change coverages. But we're going to talk about an exposure of a vehicle rental contract signed by a county driver. So Todd, under the auto liability coverage, and the acronym for auto liability is AL, that we use commonly, AL for auto liability. And Todd, under the auto liability, when renting a vehicle, should the member purchase the rental company's insurance coverage?
Great question. And so the answer is yes. If let's say that you're renting a vehicle because you're going to be attending a conference and traveling throughout the state. And let's say that you rent a vehicle from Enterprise. We do not provide physical damage coverage when a county rents a vehicle. We offer what's called hired and non-owned liability, and that's where hired comes into play, because you essentially, a hired vehicle is a vehicle that you get from a rental company when you use it to travel. So we cover the liability, but we do not cover the physical damage coverage. And so we recommend, our recommended best practice is to get the insurance from, say, Enterprise company, rental company, so that you're properly protected when you're traveling on the road. Remember, we just provide the liability, not the physical damage coverage. And you know, this is TAC Risk Management Pool, this is our coverage, but that's also very standard in the insurance industry. Hired and non-owned liability is easily gotten. It's relatively inexpensive, but most people don't get hired physical damage coverage.
Yeah, and I think this is a good idea because the rental company is going to get their money one way or the other. If you got the credit card, they're going to pay that physical damage out of your credit card. So better safe than sorry to go ahead and get that coverage, and you know,
That's
I
right.
think you'll drive at peace.
And the thing that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to tell you what's covered and what's not covered, and
Yes.
how you can plug those coverage gaps. And that's kind of what we do as a risk management consultant.
Well, something to think about is with the price of vehicles nowadays, to make repairs to a new vehicle that you may be renting can be fairly expensive. So I don't know
It's really gone up.
if your credit card will be able to meet the demands, but I think you'll be better off providing that coverage.
Right.
Yeah, we all in
Absolutely.
agreement on that one, it seems like. Okay, still on the auto liability. Ernesto, I want to ask you this commonly asked question. Can volunteers use a county-owned vehicle?
Yes, under the TAC RMP automobile liability coverage, volunteers can operate your fleet of vehicles as long as you give them permission. If you give them permission to operate, they will be covered. This falls under the permissive use of the vehicle, so yes, that will be covered.
And it could be it's the elected official giving us permission, or the supervisor
Yes.
giving them permission, somebody in authority, I guess,
Somebody in authority.
to give
yes,
them permission to
absolutely.
use the county. Okay. Yes, that's interesting. Also, this question that we get a lot, Lisa, from our members, and they ask us, should the member list trailers on their auto schedules?
Absolutely. We encourage you to list your trailers on your auto liability, and if you want the auto physical damage, you will need to also list the trailer there. So always keep in mind, if whenever you're looking at our coverage, the auto liability, you have that, auto physical damage. And again, make sure that you think about what we were just talking about. The cost of replacing your trailer now may be more than what you originally paid for it. So make sure that you select that auto physical damage. Ernesto, you shared a good thing with me
Yes.
the other day about one of your members, what they experienced. Would you mind sharing that?
No,
with
not at
everyone?
all. This is about 2 years ago. One of our members in the Northwest Territory had one of their belly dumps stolen from their yards. And a belly dump is a very expensive piece of equipment.
Yes.
Unfortunately, those things can happen. So replacing a piece of equipment like that can be very expensive on your operating budgets.
Yeah, and that's what you would want to put on the auto physical damage
Right.
for theft,
Absolutely.
for theft and,
Yes.
and vandalism and items like that. Especially your expensive trailers, you want to put them on
Yes.
there.
Yes.
To me, for physical damage, I would think
Absolutely.
$200,000 value or something like
Absolutely.
that.
And
out there.
remember,
So-
we're schedule driven. Y'all tell us what you want to have covered. So that's why it's important during your renewals to examine the schedules to make sure that all the department heads and the commissioners and Road and Bridge and law enforcement, that you get those schedules out to them to make sure that the vehicles and the trailers that they want to have covered are actually covered. Great point about, getting full coverage on the schedules. And we have a question that just came across.
Go ahead, yes. Mhm.
So the question is, are the volunteers covered under the auto liability only if the county has opted to cover volunteers? And I'll take this answer here. And
Go ahead.
that's a great question, Anita, from Nacogdoches. So are the volunteers covered under the auto liability only if the county has opted to cover volunteers? So we have two different lines of coverage and two different thoughts here. You have the option under workers' comp to cover volunteers, all others, okay? And so that's coverage under workers' comp. But if anyone is allowed to drive a county vehicle, the vehicle coverage will be applicable for the crash that would occur. So we're talking about two different lines of coverage.
Right.
And that's why it comes down to these kinds of discussions, because it might be covered over here, but it might not be covered over here. And she just
Good.
threw in, she said, thank you, understand.
Yeah,
So
that was
great
a good
question.
question.
Yeah,
Keep
that's a
them coming.
great question.
Great question.
Yeah, and volunteers, I did want to mention, they are actually listed as under our members, definition of member.
Correct.
They're on the liability coverage
the
documents.
liability,
On the
yes,
liabilities out there. So no need to let us know about those separately.
I'm glad
out
we're
there.
getting some questions in.
And
though. I
Todd,
love
before
it.
we did send out a flyer to ask for questions from
Right.
our members, and you got one back.
I
Do you
did.
want to read that one out? That was from your region.
I'll be happy to. So when we sent out the informs, we solicited if y'all had any questions of us that you wanted to be included in today's panel discussion to send them back. So big shout out to Chris out in Gregg County. So she sent me a
you.
question, and here's her question and the answer. She says, what best practices would you recommend making sure vehicle accidents are reported on a timely manner? And that's a great question because counties are big and we've got many different departments. One of the key things is communication. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But where you might want to start is your vehicle use policy. Within a vehicle use policy, you're going to have vehicle accident reporting information in there. And just think about it logically. If a member is involved in an auto accident, they're going to want to trade insurance information with the citizen or somebody, whoever that is that they're involved with the auto accident. They're going to want to gather witness reports and pictures. And one important thing is to instruct the driver never to assume liability. In lieu of a vehicle use policy, you want to make sure that there's communication within the county, making sure that everybody knows who to report an accident to. And one way that you can kind of do this is with your ID cards, because at every renewal, you receive ID cards. And if you're sending them out to the department heads, you're also reminding them, in the absence of a vehicle use policy, to who to contact if there is a claim. Because we want to make sure that those are reported timely so that we can get the vehicle fixed and keep y'all as productive as possible.
Yes, that was a good question and a good practice overall would be a good practice out there.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Todd, for that. These two we're going to be changing gears. The two previous coverages we talk about are more commonly known by our members, the workers' comp, because we get more claims on that, and the auto, because you have auto liability on your cars. But we're going to be talking now about the general liability. We're going to be changing gears. So GL is the acronym we use commonly for general liability. And general liability, it defends or pays for property damage or bodily injury to a third party caused due to a negligent act by our member. And this is just a general definition out there. And so what we're going to talk about is our next question going into the general liability. And Todd, I'm going to stay with you on this question, and because you talked about contractors earlier, and I want to ask you, what limits should contractors have when they're doing work on the county premises, or for the county, on behalf of the county?
Well, Victor, we're 20 minutes into this hour-long presentation, and we could talk about this for an awful long time. But the question that we get an awful lot is, when contractors are coming to work on the county, what limits of insurance should they have? And, first and before you get started, you want to think about it this way. You have a contractor coming on board. You want to make sure, let's say it's a painting contractor or an HVAC contractor. So you want to make sure that they have workers' compensation coverage. You want to make sure that they have auto liability coverage and general liability coverage. And on the general liability coverage, you would like for them to name the county as an additional insured. Then when you get into the limits, counties are protected by the Texas Tort Claims Act, and you have immunity that contractors don't have. So you might have lower limits than what standard insurance companies provide to contractors. So your contractors, at a minimum, they should have $500,000, more preferred for workers' compensation on the employer's liability, have $1 million limit. On auto liability, $1 million limit. On general liability, $1 million per occurrence with a $2 million aggregate, naming the county as additional insured. And depending upon the type of work that they're doing, you might even want to have them have an umbrella. So think about big projects.
It's a huge project.
And then besides that, like I said, we could talk about this for an awful long time, and we've done vendor and contract management seminars that are 2 hours long, so we're condensing this here. But you always want to look at what are they doing, what is their exposure, and how to protect the county. And by requesting these items of contractors, you're also protecting them. Because if something goes wrong, you want their coverage to respond, and you want to keep them whole, keep the county whole. It's a good way to do business.
Right. And Todd, would you say most importantly is making sure that someone in the county is managing those contracts, managing that everything is, that they get the proper certificates of coverage?
You're exactly right, Lisa. And sometimes it's purchasing that sets up these and the interlocal agreements. Sometimes it's the auditor's office. Sometimes it's the pool coordinator.
Or the risk manager even.
Yeah.
So lots of different parties involved.
Yes, and it takes an awful lot of communication and
Yes.
understanding of what you're wanting to do. And you hit it on the head. You want to make sure that you're gathering these certificates of insurance. And remember, these certificates of insurance, they expire in 6 months or 12 months. So you want to always kind of maintain these in a file.
The current.
Yes,
Right.
so they're all
Effective
current.
date.
We should do another panel discussion with us just on contract management.
Vendor and we can
Yeah.
on
we
the
can
certificate-
Todd and I
fill a
get
few
pretty
eyes.
excited about this topic.
Yes, and on the certificates of insurance, there's usually the name of the insurance company and a phone number. You may want to call it to make sure it's an
Yes.
actual company and it's actually valid and all that.
Yes.
Especially if it's a big project that's going on for the county, a big construction project or something like that. Continuing on the general liability coverage, this is for damages to a third party, bodily injury, property damage. So I want to ask you, Ernesto, this commonly asked questions. Should the member purchase special events coverage for county events such as a rodeo or a fair or something like that?
Well, it's really not necessary because the special events coverage is already provided as part of your general liability coverage. And like Todd indicated, we're very lucky that we have a certain level of protection through the Texas tort law, and we want to make sure that we maintain those type of protections. But like you indicated, we want to make sure anybody coming into your county to do any type of business, whether it's a rodeo, a fair, parade, whatever the case may be, they need to make sure that they have coverage. And like Lisa also alluded to, we want to make sure that those certificates are in place and they're current.
Absolutely.
And that's one thing I want to mention. Counties have these coverages, general liability, workers' comp, but do they? We need to know if they
Correct.
have it.
Yeah,
know?
Correct.
Kind of jumping on there, our TAC Risk Management Pool general liability coverage automatically covers these special events. But if your coverage is not with us, you're going to want to examine your general liability, because I looked at one recently where they have their coverage elsewhere, and they asked me to take a look at their coverage, and fireworks shows are excluded. So that type of special event is excluded, and you'll just want to make sure that you have good understanding of what is the exposure and how is it covered or not covered. So that's always good risk management and best practices to understand those kinds of things.
Another common practice I've seen some of the counties do for special events is they ask for a hold harmless agreement or a waiver that they won't sue the county. So there's a couple of double protection there. But definitely you want to be primary, make sure they have coverage.
We always recommend to our members to consult with their county attorney.
Absolutely.
To draft some of those documents. So
Right.
that would be good practice for sure.
Yes. Yeah. And many of those can be found on the internet, but yes, check with the county attorney, check
Absolutely.
with us. We'll help you with that also. Us risk management consultants can take a look at that, give you some advice.
And Lisa, we
on
got
that.
we got a comment here that says, yes, looking forward to the vendor and contract management webinar.
I was just about to say, we know what our next live panel discussion is going to be.
All right, so that was the general liability. Now let's move on to the public officials liability coverage. And we commonly use the acronym of PO. PO for the public officials liability. That's how we recognize that coverage out there. So public officials liability coverage, it defends or pays for monetary damages due to a wrongful act committed by a member. And it's again for a third party, damages to a third party based on a wrongful act committed by our member. And Lisa, I want to start with you on this one under the public officials liability. Who is a covered member under the public officials liability coverage?
Okay, so that's going to be your elected or appointed officials, employees, or volunteers of your county, the named member, acting within the scope of their official capacity.
So basically, everybody who works at the county is covered by the public officials liability coverage, and the volunteers.
Yes, as long as they are within the scope of their official capacity.
Correct.
Official
Correct.
capacity. And those are listed in our coverage documents. All the liabilities have the definition of member and include that specifically worded in the document.
Yes.
So we can't get out of that contract. It's a contract.
Did you want to add something, Ernesto?
Yes, I do. Because I was just thinking about the extensive list that you just went through. And many times when we go out and we do training that addresses public officials liability coverage, many times some of these individuals are not included in the communication. And we need to make sure that they are informed as to the do's and don'ts that could possibly increase their liability under public officials liability.
Yeah, and like I said, we're here to defend our member. And with all of these coverage, we're going to defend our member first.
And to your point, Ernesto, that's where the human resources consultants come into play, because they work directly with the members on their public officials liabilities, harassment prevention training, and those kinds of employment practices items that we want the county to be operating correctly.
Absolutely.
To
Yes.
avoid a claim. You know, we talk about all these coverages that we have, but nobody wants to have a claim. Nobody wants to use their coverage because it means that something bad has happened. So we've got these coverages as a safety net, but nobody really wants to use them.
Well, public officials liability, you know this, they can be, those claims can be very expensive.
Yes.
But also can be very embarrassing for the members. So we
Right.
definitely need to be in front of it.
And they
avoid those.
last a long time
do.
because you might have a discrimination or a harassment type of claim, and it takes a long time from start to finish. But to Victor's point, the first thing that happens on those is we investigate and then we defend the county when needed.
Yeah. And that's why we're telling you about these unique exposures of county government so you can prepare for them, be aware of them, and do something about it. Because if you know about it, do anything, is the exposure still there whether you address it or not? So back on the public officials liability, Todd, I want to go back to you on this question. Does the member have cyber coverage and ransomware under the public officials liability coverage?
Yes, and we get this question quite a lot, and you know, with the current times. So if our counties and other political subdivisions had their public officials liability coverage with us, they also have cyber coverage with us. Our cyber coverage is a separate dedicated $2 million limit, specifically to cyber.
Yeah.
The coverage works. Let's say that you have a cyber incident. It's subject to your public official's deductible, $5,000, $10,000. Larger counties have a $25,000 or a $50,000 deductible. It's subject to your deductible. But if you have an incident, you contact us, you make the claim. We will then contact a cyber coach who will reach out to the county. Normally they reach out to members of the Commissioner's Court, law enforcement, the IT director, and they're gonna, the cyber coach will reach out and ask questions on what happened. First and foremost, it's about forensics, because we need to understand what's happening with the cyber incident. If public relations assistance is needed, if there's a data breach, we will help you with that. Also, it provides notification expense. If data has been taken, we then need, by law, we need to notify the public. That's covered by your cyber coverage. Credit monitoring of those individuals up to 1 year, that is covered. And regulatory fines and fees, that's covered. But forensics and also if there's damage done to your software, your hardware, your servers, we have a $100,000 sublimit. About the question about ransom, okay? We have a small sublimit of $10,000 to cover the ransomware expenses. If ransom is demanded and agreed to, the $10,000 limit will cover the expenses of setting up that ransom. It's a little dicey because, believe it or not, our attorneys will reach out to the bad guys and have those discussions.
And that's what I was going to mention. Let us help you with that. We
Yes.
got that forensic scientist that'll come look into it. We got people that'll speak on behalf of the county. All that's part of the claim that
Right.
would be covered.
And by having cyber coverage, you've got the experts on retainer.
Yes.
I'm more of an expert on the cyber liability coverage. I am not the claims expert. So really you have a great team at your fingertips. And I highly encourage all of you to put our contact information into your cell phones. Because when these cyber incidents happen, people don't like to send emails because your servers have been compromised. So we're doing everything remotely over the phone. So make sure that you contact us, our 24/7 claims hotline number, which is 888-47-CLAIM. So there's many things to think about with cyber.
Right. And folks, this is becoming more and more common. We're seeing it more with municipalities.
More claims.
I just got a notice yesterday in the mail where my information had been compromised, which explains why earlier this year my credit card was all with the same company. So, I had fraud on my credit card. Now I'm getting notified that, yes, my information was exposed. They're offering me the credit monitoring. We're not immune to this,
Yeah.
It's,
And we'll do the
it's
same
not,
for our member. We'll monitor
what
those
is
and help
it
them.
you say? It's
No.
not a matter of if, but when.
when, yes.
So
It's
be
happening more
aware of your
often.
coverages.
It's happening more often.
And I just want to follow up. The pool has made it very easy for our members to report this type of claims. You can go into our website and do a reporting of any claim, any of the lines of coverage that we've
Yes.
been discussing here. But when it comes to cybersecurity, we definitely need to make sure that we know about it
Yes.
as soon as possible so we can implement some of the tools that Todd
Absolutely.
and
Don't
Lisa
sit on it.
discussed.
Yeah.
No,
Don't
no.
sit
Because
on
they
it.
mentioned some of the forensic scientists, because usually when they have a virus, it's been there for a while. It's been there a couple of months. So it's not like something new. out there.
Absolutely.
So
And we've got some information on the chat box here, and thank you, Lee. So we are having a webinar on September 29th. We're going to be sending out an Informs, and the webinar on September 29th is about cyber. So thank you. Most of you are notified about today's webinar through the Informs. So keep an eye out for the information on the upcoming cyber webinar.
Yes.
Ernesto, continuing on the public official cyber coverage, does the TAC Risk Management Pool offer IT assessments?
That's an excellent question. Yes and no. The pool does not have a way of conducting a survey on your network. However, we do have a service that can allow you to complete an assessment. There's two assessments, a short and a long version
Yeah,
of the
there's a
assessment
poster.
through the eRisk portal. It's a portal where you can find the assessments, you can find sample policies, a little bit of training available there. You can also find white papers on what is going on in the cyber world. And we highly encourage our elected officials to take advantage of this service that we make available to you. If you would like to have access to the portal, please send an email
Contact
to
any of
each
us.
one of the consultants, and we'll make sure that you have credentials. But we do have a way for you to complete an assessment. I highly encourage that at least you take the time to complete the short version of that assessment. That'll give you a quick snapshot
Yes.
as to where your system security is in place, and give you a baseline as to where you want to start working with that.
There's so much good information on the e-risk.
It
Hub.
is. It is.
I was fortunate to do a training last week with our associate director and going through there, the sample policies that are out there for our members. You know, the news is so up to date on what's happening and
What's the most current
Yes,
trend? What's the
yes.
most current virus going on? What areas it's hitting?
Yes.
And I like that it has a resiliency plan, and I think our counties need to use that more.
Oh,
Because that way
absolutely.
it tells
Absolutely,
you what
yes.
what are you going to do when you do go down.
Right.
And
Yeah.
at least have a plan.
Your business continuity plan. And
Right.
you think about this, when you're looking at cyber or when you're looking at your risk management program as a whole, be brutally honest with yourself, because you are looking for your deficiencies. You're trying to identify your weaknesses and improve on those weaknesses. And the business continuity plan, Victor, it's very important, because you need to respond to cyber incidents, and you need to respond if there's a weather event. You need to respond if there's an auto accident. But your business continuity planning leads you in those directions.
Yeah.
Right.
Most counties want to get to business right away.
Right.
So to have this plan ahead of time would probably help. I mean, I know it will help.
Yes.
Well,
Get this
you
done.
put the business continuity plan, you write it up, and then you practice it.
right.
You
So
know?
mark your calendars for September 29th.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You don't want to miss that webinar on cyber.
So do
Absolutely.
y'all have any other questions under the public officials liability? Because otherwise we're going to change gears and talk about the law enforcement liability. And we call that LE acronym, law enforcement liability. And law enforcement liability defends or pays for monetary damages to a third party due to a wrongful act committed by our member. And Lisa, I'll ask you the first question under the law enforcement liability. Is moonlighting in the sheriff's department a covered activity?
Okay, so possibly it could be covered. It depends on the capacity of how the officer is represented. But most important, it must be approved by the sheriff, first and foremost. For example, if the law enforcement activities on behalf of the county and the compensation is authorized by the county, the sheriff has approved it, then it would be covered.
Correct.
And we
Correct.
see
Okay.
more and more moonlighting,
Yes, I mean,
with our members.
those officers sometimes don't get paid a lot of money, and they do need to take on an additional job
Yes.
to, make ends meet, and I know that a lot of the smaller counties can't afford to pay much, and they do that. And they're
Right.
allowed to do it. Most of them are allowed to do it by the sheriff. The sheriff
Yes.
knows about it. They wear the deputy uniform where they're at, and it's approved out there. But also, that approval by the sheriff is very important, because
Most
it's
important.
even written in our coverage document.
yes, it
That it
is.
says that in our
Yes.
contract with you.
And
out there.
one thing to think about with your law enforcement officers, when they're moonlighting, it adds to their fatigue factor. So,
Yes, good point,
'cause-
especially with the shortages
Yes.
in law enforcement.
So be mindful of that. Let's make sure that people are getting the rest that they need, so that they're performing those jobs
Yes.
and the jobs for the county as well. And fatigue is part of risk management. It's something that we identify that we want to attempt to avoid.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we want everyone to be safe in their role at the county.
Absolutely. And, with my risk management hat right now, you just have to understand that when you allow moonlighting, yes, the fatigue factor is a concern, but you're expanding your liability. It is a fact, because you're out there more. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And Ernesto, I'll stick with you on the next question.
Okay.
Can law enforcement agencies participate in mutual aid agreements with other political entities?
Yes. The question I get a lot of times is, can I participate in a mutual agreement with another entity? The answer is yes. But the thing that we have to understand is that you cannot extend coverage to another entity. So if anything happens when you're doing this this work with this another agency, whatever happens within your employees or your anything related to your account, that's what's going to be handled. You cannot extend coverage to other agencies. And this is something that I highly recommend to our members when they're selecting their coverages. If they keep all their coverages with, whether it's with the TAC or anybody else, you run less of a risk of having gaps in your coverage. So I highly encourage that you take a look into that.
Most of the times when they're doing those mutual aid agreements, they're doing them with a municipality, they're doing them with DPS or a drug task force.
Yes, that's another one, task force.
Right, and so our coverage will provide protection for the county individuals, but we won't provide protection for the other entities. And normally, if you think about the municipalities, they have their own coverage.
Yes.
The state has their coverage. So we cover you when you're involved with that, up to the point, but we don't cover anybody else.
Well, like Lisa
Correct,
indicated, Victor, right now, unfortunately, so many agencies across the state are lacking the manpower. I got a call, this is about 3-4 months ago, from a member who wanted to contract with the city police department to help with the patrol.
Yes.
And they wanted to extend the coverage. So this is the conversation we had to have with the member. Unfortunately, I know that they were trying to solve an issue, but we needed to be transparent with the member and understand that we cannot extend coverage to the other agency. Yes, thank you.
But if it's another county that wants coverage with us, we can definitely help them. You know, but not a city or anything, but another county, we can help them.
They will have to have the coverage to
Yes,
us.
through
so we
us,
can help
through
them.
us. I mean, get the
Yes.
coverage with us.
Both
to do
members
that.
have to have that
Yes,
coverage.
both members
Yes.
will have to have the coverage, yes.
Yes. Well, that's very good. Like I said, I see a lot of those mutual aid agreements, task force involvements, and different items out there in my area also. And also talking, now, you know what? Now law enforcement agencies are using drones. And one thing I want to ask is, they've been asking, and I'll ask you, Todd, is how do we cover drones?
Drones are cool.
They
Yes,
are.
they are.
I tell you, 10 years ago, nobody thought about a drone. 9 years ago, people started thinking about drones because they came out into the public eye and people are using them. There's so many applications for use of drones. You can examine buildings that are damaged. You can do an aerial survey, search and rescue, you name
yeah.
it can be done with a drone. So the TAC Risk Management Pool, we cover drones 3 ways. The first 2 are on general liability and general liability and law enforcement liability. But to be covered under general liability and law enforcement liability, they need to be FAA certified. So the drone and the operator need to take an FAA certification. And a lot of the members that I've been working with in the Northeast region, we have these discussions. So whenever y'all get a drone, make sure you reach out to one of us or a member services, and we'll walk you through the process. I mentioned they're covered 3 ways: general liability, law enforcement liability, and there's automatic coverage on property. So if you buy a drone and it hasn't been FAA certified just yet, know that you don't need to report it to us for property coverage. You've got a sublimit of $100,000 where the drones are automatically covered. In most of our claims, and we haven't had a whole bunch, but the ones that we have, I understand that the drone might have been stolen out of somebody's vehicle in transit. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, so if it's over $100,000, they would need to have that scheduled, right? The drone under the property.
Correct. And you know, what I think about drones 8 years ago, I learned of a drone that cost $33,000 because this drone had every bell and whistle on it. But now drones are less expensive. So even some of the larger counties, I have one county that has up to 10 drones. It still hasn't touched the $100,000 limit because they're $5,000, $7,000, $2,500. They're all different sizes and shapes. So we think that $100,000 blanket limit will cover it. But once again, you're always examining your exposures when you go through the renewals to make sure that you understand what's covered.
I can see this could get a little confusing for our members. For me personally, if I was submitting it. So whenever I'm adding this with my member service rep, they're going to ask me these questions.
Yes.
So that I can make sure that I'm getting it covered whenever I submit that information.
Yes,
So if it needs
definitely.
to, it's gonna
We'll help in those
automatically
areas.
be under property. If it's over 100,000, we're gonna list it.
Correct?
Okay, good,
Todd,
good.
is there a separate deductible for the drone under the property coverage? Or do they follow the deductible that you have in place?
Oh, good question.
Ooh, thank you, Ernesto. You kind of threw me a curveball.
Sorry, I just thought about it.
I think it's the all other peril
think it's
deductible.
Just regular deductible, just your general
We,
deductible.
folks, we didn't
Yes.
rehearse that question and answer.
No, it just popped in. I thought that was part of the discussion here.
yeah. No,
Well, that
yeah.
leads into the good next
I
coverage.
got a
You one more?
question.
Go ahead.
I got a question
Go ahead.
here. So we're still on law
Right.
enforcement, and we're about to go
She's
to property.
asking what I was saying, yes.
So her question is, so we need to specifically schedule our drones only if $100,000 is a cost for one or all of them. So you are correct. So let's say that you have 10 drones and you know that the cost of the drones doesn't exceed $100,000, you're good. If you've got 20 drones and it goes up to $125,000, reach out to us. Let's have a discussion because we need to start scheduling some.
And Todd, I was thinking from the same information they obtained for the law enforcement and the general liability, that same information we have because we captured it there. So we do have the details of that drone from over.
You're
Right.
exactly right, Victor, because that he's alluding to the renewal questionnaires that come across. Wendy, I just want to make sure, did we answer your
Right.
question correctly?
And Wendy is, she's one of my members in the coastal area, the southeast region. And we do have a lot of drones down there, especially they will use them for flooding, the hurricane season that we're in. So Wendy, thank you for sending that question in.
Thank you. Yes.
Excellent question.
And folks out there, be ready because the applications of drones, they're gonna be used more and more and more. When they first came out, I wasn't a fan, but after I realized the applications and their
yeah.
usage, I'm a big fan of it.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
it is. Yeah.
Absolutely.
They can help find people in their community
Right,
that are in danger, animals.
And this drone coverage, covering it three ways: general liability, law enforcement, and it's a good segue
Property.
over to our property coverage.
Which we usually call PR, for property. PR is commonly known for
So
property.
many acronyms.
And since we're talking property and we talked a little bit law enforcement, Ernesto, I want to ask you, are canines and law enforcement horses covered under the risk management pool property coverage?
Yes, they are covered. Canine and law enforcement horses are covered under your property coverage. They'll cover for death, theft, and loss of use. There's no need to schedule the animals. We provide you coverage up to $30,000. There is I believe there's a limit on the dogs up to 8 years, but I don't think we have a limit on the horses.
Correct.
But we definitely need to make sure that you take care of those
Yeah,
animals.
and more of a law enforcement, sheriff's departments do have the dogs, and if something should happen to them, there are valuable animals, and
very
they did
expensive.
cost the county
Yes.
some money to get them. So if something happens to them, they will get it's a payable claim.
Right.
Absolutely,
You know,
absolutely.
Also, continuing on the property coverage, Lisa, are vacant buildings covered under the property?
Okay, so let's talk about vacant buildings. So a vacant building, think about that. It's different than a vacant property that you have is under construction or repairs. So I'm going to specifically answer your question to vacant property.
buildings, yes.
And that's going to be a building that's been vacant for more than 90 days before some type of claim happens or the loss occurs. So the pool will not pay for any loss or damage that's caused by vandalism, sprinkler leakage, building glass breakage, water damage, theft, or attempted theft. And this is on a true vacant building. And
That's
it's
been vacant for 90 days.
90 days.
Been vacant for 90
So
days.
if you've got your courthouse, y'all have all moved out of the courthouse and it's under reconstruction, repairs, this would not be
would not be
applicable
vacant.
to
Yeah,
that.
it's not
It's not
vacant.
considered vacant.
It's under construction,
Yeah,
reconstruction.
you're doing the repairs on that building. So I don't want to confuse anybody there whenever I answer
And I
that
think we have some
question.
coverage for buildings under construction.
Yes,
Yep,
You know,
yes,
the county's
yes.
doing it, and then we have builder's risk. If somebody else is doing the construction,
Right.
so that's a different
Right.
area.
I don't want anyone to panic. If you're moved out of your courthouse temporarily, you're okay, you're covered.
Kind of the moral of the story is all of us, most of the counties, you've got those buildings that aren't used as much as others, okay? So make sure that building and maintenance is paying attention to those buildings.
Oh,
you know,
good,
you
yeah.
think about, we talked earlier about how we have this coverage, but how nobody wants to use it. Think about when cold weather comes into play. You want to make sure that you get in front of that cold weather and are going out and opening the doors within the building, opening the door to the water heater, putting the thermostat up so that the ambient temperature doesn't get below 55 degrees. It's those kinds of things. But outside of a cold weather snap, you still want to make sure that facilities and maintenance are going out to these buildings on a quarterly basis to inspect them, to make sure there's not water running or there's any kind of exposure that can cause damage to a building.
Okay, I think we have a question. Let's clarify something real quick. So you said no, they are not covered. So I guess we need a little bit more details. The vacant buildings? The vacant buildings are covered, but just not if they've been vacant for more than 90 days.
It's those
There's
losses.
certain
It's
perils.
those specific losses that I went over, the vandalism,
Go over them.
sprinkler leakage, building glass breakage, water damage, the theft or attempted theft. If that is the reason of the loss, it would not be covered on a vacant building.
And those are called perils. So if the building burned down, that's covered.
So if there was a
Yes.
fire to the vacant building, it covered.
It's covered. But if there's sprinkler leakage to the building and it's been vacant for more than 90 days
Yes.
and it meets the definition of our vacant clause in our coverage document, you got to love this business because it comes down to all the details. The sprinkler leakage would not be covered. Okay, so we can address these
again,
with our members.
And this is in general.
Yes.
You know,
It's in
every claim has
general.
to be
Yes.
looked at.
Well,
you
let's
know,
talk-
so but
yes.
in general, they would not be covered.
Right.
You know, just a scenario.
Every
but
claim
everything
is-
could get complicated. It was vacant for a few days, and it wasn't. Then it was. Then that has to be evaluated by.
But just like always, and I speak to our members about this, if you're not sure, report the claim.
Yes.
Let our claims department make that determination of whether it's covered or not, because we will do everything possible to find coverage for you.
It's worth a try.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's worth a try.
And
Absolutely.
it might be good to say at this point, every claim is, whenever they review it, is based on the merits of that specific claim.
You're exactly
Absolutely.
right.
So don't take this as your coverage for your claim, but make sure you submit that claim.
Yes, absolutely.
And from the risk control perspective, we need to make sure that we include all the properties as part of your routine inspections of these buildings. Even if you know they're vacant, stop by, make sure that some of the stuff
Yes,
hasn't
like
taken
Todd was
place.
saying with the
So,
building maintenance
absolutely.
program,
So
yeah.
it's part of your building.
Yeah, no, that's still
Absolutely.
part of the property of the county. They
They
still
are.
could be negligence for slip and falls under
are.
different coverage, general
They are.
liability. So
You know,
there's other items.
and we all know this. If you aren't using things, they become in disrepair. You know, it's better to
Right.
use things. You know, you take an old vehicle and you don't use it, it just starts to gum up and not work. Same thing with buildings.
Don't tell me that. I have a truck in the back of my house.
You know, there was a new clause added to our property coverage, Todd.
Yes.
And I wanted you to go over it because it's new to us. We've never had it before. So, and it's called the new margin clause, which was effective 7/1/22 for the property coverage. Will you tell us about it, Todd?
Yeah, happy to. So effective July 1st of 2022, and this margin clause only applies to historically covered buildings.
Historical buildings.
So most of our members, you have replacement cost coverage on your buildings, but for those members who have historical buildings and are covered historically, it's called historical reconstruction cost.
Yes.
We have a margin clause which caps its loss, if there's a total loss, at 125%. So let's say that we have a historical building and its historical replacement cost is $10 million. And I'm including its contents and its site improvements, which are the flagpoles and
Yeah,
the
just to
monuments
keep
and
it
those
simple.
things.
Yeah.
So we've got a $10 million limit. Let's say it's a total loss. It's capped at 125%. So it would be capped at $12.5 million in that example. Now, also know we appraise your buildings. And so all the buildings that are being historically covered have been recently historically replacement cost appraised.
Yes,
because
reconstruction.
because The margin clause doesn't work unless you have a current and accurate appraisal for that said building. And as you meet with us, we'll be talking to you about that.
Yeah.
And for my Southeast members, this is just a reminder to you that your property appraisals will be happening this year. We're already in the process. Some of you may have already been appraised by Asset Works, but know that that's coming on your property in 2022.
So we have a question. I want to go back to
Sure.
the vacancy. So Denise sent in a question. Her question is, we have a couple storage buildings that are not occupied, but someone goes in occasionally to get something or pick up something. How is that considered? Denise, that's a great question, because coming into the vacant clause, vacant is defined in our coverage document. Honestly, it's like on page 47 of 51. And Denise, I'll talk with you on that. But basically, let's see if I can recall this, because I don't want to get too far into the weeds. You got it?
It's kind of says if you don't have the contents in that building that it would be used for its normal operations or business operations, if you don't have those contents in those buildings and it's not being used for what it was intended for, those operations or that business, is considered vacant.
Correct. And there's a percentage there, and it's 10%.
There you go.
Of the square footage. It's a low,
Yes.
candidly, Denise, it's a low standard. And, because vacant buildings, vacancy in insurance terms is something that candidly I've struggled with in my insurance career. And I always need to revisit the coverage document, and I'll need to do the same thing whenever this kind of question comes up. That's why I'm glad Lisa had this question and not me.
So now it may be considered a warehouse? Is it a warehouse where they're storing it? And so now that's their building's operation is a warehouse, as long as someone else goes and manages the building, checks on it, they have electricity. I think it mentions something about not having power also.
I think it does,
on
yes.
the exclusion, so there's other things that apply for the exclusion to kick in.
Right.
Lisa, Denise, based upon your question, I think you're okay. And, believe it or not, we address these. These claims don't happen that often. And when they do, we'll examine them one by one by one.
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to the margin clause. I just wanted to mention that that's kind of used to make sure that these courthouses are not undervalued. So we get them appraised to the historical values, and that's what we're appraising them now for.
Yeah.
So hopefully they won't be undervalued and we'll cover them. But that's really why the margin clause was that, because we want to make sure they're properly valued.
Yeah, let me jump in also, and we're coming in, we got 3 minutes left in our presentation, but it's really the market that is driving this margin clause, because
Yes.
we need to protect y'all, but we also need to protect the pool's exposure. So that the key to this margin clause is the appraisal.
Yes.
Okay.
And we're doing that for them.
And we do that for y'all. So
Thank you.
great point on that.
Last coverage we want to talk about is the crime. And we usually know that as the CR. And it's included it's a sub-coverage of your property coverage. So that's where you'll find your crime coverage. And one of the common questions that we get on this, Lisa, is, does an elected official need to have a bond even though the member has crime coverage?
Okay, so the bond is a state statute and it is required. Our crime coverage that's part of our property coverage document is excess to that bond limit of the county. We also get asked a lot of questions. Do y'all provide bonds? Does TAC provide bonds? TAC does not provide bonds. The county can get those bonds from a local agent for their
Usually
officials,
either the county judge or somebody buys it for all the members or something.
And I do want to let everybody know on our website, thecounty.org, under our legal drop-down, there is a publication for the oath and bond requirements for county officials. It's a great resource. We can always send you a link to that if you need it. That's usually what I do when members have the questions about who has to have a bond.
Yeah.
I get that frequently.
And in general, I wanted to mention that our crime coverage covers theft, disappearance, destruction of money, securities, and other valuable papers, items like that. In general, theft and disappearance, mainly I've seen claims of theft.
Employee dishonesty.
Employee dishonesty.
Yes.
Or an elected official dishonesty.
The thing that I always remember and say to the members, if there's a statutory requirement for a bond, you're required to get the bond. You also have our crime coverage, which can be excess of the bond. And that way, everybody's happy and everybody's properly covered. And most of the time you get your bonds from your local agent that you've had for years and years and years.
Correct. And I think that leaves it to our last, is there any more questions?
There's no questions online. Thank you for the comment that you've enjoyed the webinar. Thanking all of us for this great information. Victor, you're going to let our members know.
Yes, I did want to mention that we are going to have a document with these questions that we reviewed, the frequently asked, with the answers. And if you want these, just email any of us to get it, any of us consultants. You can use our first name initial and our last name at county.org. For example, Victor, you at county.org. And you can ask for that, and we'll send you this document with the answers and questions. And the same thing for Ernesto and Elisa and Todd. First initial, last name at county.org, and we'll send you this information. Give us your feedback. Let us know if you like this class. How can we make it better? Tell us what other topics you'd like to hear. Send in additional questions for the future or just to keep us sharp. Either way, thank you, and until next time.
Thank you.
We'll see
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for spending the morning with us.
Thank you.